All right. Welcome to the podcast, Alexander.
Thank you.
I want to just, I'm going to read this bio um, about you just to give some context for the viewer. Um, Alexander Nemser, is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yep.
Okay. Is a poet, writer, and facilitator based in Los Angeles. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, and the Paris Review. Good work. Among other publications, his book, The Sacrifice of Abraham, 50 Wild Retellings of the Isaac and Abraham Story, was published in 2014. He leads workshops on authentic spirituality and creativity and is currently training in the Mindfulness Meditation Teacher Certification Program. And, I want to ask you in a bit more about your workshops because I am curious about that. But first, I want to start with a Zen question. I've been asking all my guests this Zen question to begin with. So, and, oddly enough, some of the language that you used in your newest monologue piece, which I'm going to link in the show notes, kind of touches on a similar theme. But the question is, all things return to the one. Where does the one return to?
So, it's interesting, I could think of a Buddhist response to the question. There's another part of me, that hears it, or you could hear it also as a very Jewish question, in terms of, the kind of centerpiece prayer in Judaism is the Shema, which goes, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And it sort of expresses, I feel like, the same type of primordial unity.
Yeah.
And then these days, and this is partly because I'm becoming a meditation teacher and thinking a lot about the poignancy of how much is indescribable, how much of being with a capital B is just not to be communicated completely.
Mm-hmm.
There's a kind of beautiful failure, I guess, to that. I actually find it very fertile, the acknowledgement that that between what we can say or communicate, especially with language, and maybe transmit at all, and the depth of being itself, or our experience of being, there's such a gulf. And I kind of feel like that gulf sits in the place that the one returns to.
I love it. That's great. Yeah. Well, yeah, I wanna ask you some more stuff related to that, but I feel like the most the most generative and useful way for me to kind of frame these conversations is kind of blasting back um, in the past. And so I how religious was your upbringing?
Yeah, so I guess if you want to use religious in the way that people normally use it, as in observant in an organized way, it was barely religious at all.
Mm.
I grew up outwardly Reform Jewish, So we would sometimes go to a Reform or maybe conservative synagogue on the high holidays. I had a bar mitzvah at a Reform temple in Boston. And we would do Passover and Hanukkah at home. So I would say, like, not very religious, but like intensely spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still trying to understand exactly like what kind of transmission was going on in my household because it was very unconscious.
Mm.
Like, or it was never, I don't think that the like the full like breadth slash onslaught slash treasure of what my parents transmitted, I think a lot of it was not even in their awareness.
Mm.
um but just to say, like, I sometimes like to say that like outwardly we were kind of like secular, basically like intellectual, cultural Jews just living the middle class life in America. But the experience in the home or like in the like nucleus of the family, it was as if we were like Hasidic, like pious mystics still
Mm-hmm.
in the shtetl.
Mm.
It was very poetic, and the depth of feeling around, especially like Jewish literature, and then also English poetry, especially romantic poetry, like the feeling of spirit as well as like being haunted by ancestors and stuff, that was very strong. So
Mm.
it's strange, like there was a lot of soul and no religion.
Mm. Okay. Did you feel when you were a kid and a teenager, did you feel personally engaged with spirituality, or did you kind of, were you, um, uninterested in it in any way, or did you kind of always gravitate toward authentic spirituality on a personal level?
I don't think that you would have said I was like outwardly involved in it at the time, or like from, if you saw how I was operating as a child, I don't think you would have said that is a very spiritual child.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I always had a really strong sense of like the depth of what was going on in the invisible world. Like
Mm-hmm.
I always thought there is a vast, like, I don't even know what you would, like later on, in literature and in things, you start to hear these phrases like there's a world within the world,
Mm-hmm.
or there's like a secret underground river, that flows kind of beneath life, or there's like some sense of a parallel timeless time, or those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of mystical things. And I felt a strong sense of that always,
Mm.
which is sort of just to say, like, I always felt that the forces that were really in the driver's seat of life, at least my life, my loved ones, that those forces were not, you couldn't exhaust them by what was visible.
Mm.
Like, there was other energies that were obviously exerting like a profound influence.
Yeah.
Nowadays, like in a more like, I guess, aware or grounded way, that's kind of a way of talking about inherited trauma for me.
Mm,
That there was this feeling of like some of our consciousness was just profoundly still living in a like virtual space that was not connected to the here and now of the moment of
mm,
reality.
mm.
And that was because there's like this kind of weird like lag or looping thing that happens with unprocessed trauma where you're sort of constantly being like yanked out of the present into
Mm.
the like virtual space.
Yeah.
So I had a really strong feeling of like we are all often being yanked, but
Hmm.
I didn't know, like I thought it was more like ghosts when I was a kid. I
Uh-huh.
was much more feeling it, I would have probably, if I had had the opportunity to talk about it honestly
Hmm.
or objectively, I think I would have said like it's kind of like being haunted.
Hmm.
Um, the other piece though is one of the like most profound gifts from my parents and from especially from my dad was like how engaged with poetry we were and how
Nice.
engaged with poetry he was. So I was apparently like I memorized Tiger Tiger Burning Bright by William Blake and could say it when I was 2.
Damn.
And I don't think I could say obviously like that I really remember that, but I do, and I think I probably, before I knew the meaning, I knew that the sounds were powerful.
Hmm.
And there was this feeling, I think some combination of like this William Blake type thing and other like we had all these wonderful like nonsense poems and children's poems that like we were always saying, and then also having Hebrew in your life where like you don't know what any of it means, but you know that the sounds are basically magic spells,
Hmm.
or like today I would say that it was like prayer, the power of prayer, that prayer is like using language in a way that sort of like, yeah, I guess it connects you with the place that the one returns to,
Mm.
if you want to say it that
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
So there was a really very intense feeling around language and around this invisible stuff, but it was like there was also no structure as in like a religion or even a spirituality in which to like express or articulate or even like chat about all this stuff.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
took me a really long time to finally like be able to give names to some of this stuff. It was
Yeah.
all just happening.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Recently I've been I'm writing I'm writing a book right now, and I've been doing a lot of research about various spiritual traditions, mainly, mystical traditions and esoteric traditions. And, um, I've really just been exploring kind of classic questions about form and formlessness, soul and spirit, that which changes
Mm-hmm.
versus that which is changeless. Um, and so I wanted, based on some of the stuff you said, like the kind of the virtual forces that were impacting your life growing up, and I assume you kind of still feel like those virtual forces are present in your life still. And the way I've been thinking about spirit and soul, I've been thinking of soul as that which leaves traces and remembers and evolves and stores and this invisible reservoir or something that we can tap into and that we are produced out of in a way. And then I've been thinking of spirit as kind of the timeless, or the unconditioned, or something like that. And perhaps even with some of the stuff you just said, maybe spirit would be that which the one returns to, kind of, or like and so I'm just curious what you think about is there anything in reality that is unchanging?
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful distinction. I don't think I've heard that before, of just using spirit and soul in those ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the nuance that there is something that is of, like, I like the nuance because it feels true to my experience that there is some aspect of the timeless part of us that also stores and that also leaves traces.
I've been trying to navigate that. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about that. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, that's a beautiful investigation. I appreciate the distinction that you made. Uh, oh yeah, okay. So is there something timeless or enduring in reality? Well, I mean, obviously, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't really know because I have only the evidence of my senses
Mm-hmm.
and then shit that I heard, or,
Right.
inklings. Um, I one thing I can say to preface, I sometimes, or for a while, I had this, I had kind of a season in my life where I was spending a lot of time at an ashram outside of New York City. I wasn't living there, but I went there often to take refuge from the city. And the people at the ashram were really into this particular Vedanta teacher named James Swartz, who you can find him all over YouTube. And he's basically like a crotchety Montana former businessman who became kind of like a completely enlightened being, sort of, or like, anyway, he's like an amazing Vedanta teacher, not,
Cool.
like non-dualism teacher.
Advaita Vedanta, yeah.
Yeah, and he said some very juicy stuff, but one of the things he said that really stuck with me, kind of along the lines of this thing about like the beautiful failure, or the humility and of when we see how much is inexpressible.
Mm-hmm.
He said that the thing that a spiritual person is trying to know from firsthand experience, that very thing is out of the range of the equipment we have for knowing.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, we have particular, like sense organs and educational conditioning and like human hardware. And fundamentally, what we most want to know as a spiritual, like seeking type of person, the hardware is incapable of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, wow, okay, that's interesting. Like, then, again, like there's this kind of sense of, I guess, like surrender
Mm-hmm.
and like, okay, I guess I'm not going to ever know the very most important thing that my whole being longs to know,
Yeah.
And so I kind of think like that, like that there should be something timeless inherent in reality, or as in like not maybe like the whole transcendent reality, but the reality that I can access with my five senses, or the the reality where I like pay with American dollars and I have a sandwich, and I
Yeah.
go on my email, like, the reality of ordinary life.
Yeah.
Like, I don't, yeah, I think it's kind of true that I'm, as a human with human hardware, I'm not equipped to know the timeless that is inherent in reality. But I appreciate, in different like traditions, there's some idea or other of holy longing, sacred longing, or yearning. And nowadays, I kind of feel like, okay, I'm not equipped to know the most important thing. So I can almost like give up on knowing that, which saves me a lot of headache
Yeah.
and disappointment, or even despair.
Hmm.
And instead, more like try to have a more intimate relationship with my longing for the timeless.
Interesting. Yeah, that's beautiful. I just wanted to say, I know that for one, all of my reflections on spiritual matters are experimental and tentative, and I'm what I said about spirit and soul is just an idea I'm playing around with, and I also want to say that I know it sounds dualistic the way I said that, but I don't think of it as a dualism. I mean, I definitely connect most with non-dual traditions, whether it's Advaita Vedanta or certain streams of Buddhism like Zen and Mahayana and Vajrayana, whatever. So I never want my vision to be dualistic. So I guess when I think about the whole spirit and soul thing, it's almost like I think about God or the divine or the all or the infinite as, maybe the two primary modes of expression or something, is the timeless and that which is in the context of time. But yeah, I wanted to ask you another question related to this before we move on to something else, because lately I've just been journaling about my own theology, right? It's like I'm just trying to process my own sense of my own theology, and in several traditions that I'm drawn to, that I've been reading about and reflecting on, there's this common notion that is, there is nothing outside of God, right? And I really feel like I it's hard for me to disagree with that. It's hard for me to disagree with the notion that there is nothing outside of God. And I know that on a conventional level, that sounds crazy to most people, because most people don't see it that way. But how about you? Do you think there's anything outside of God?
Well, I just to go back, like, I think, like, I love using the language of experiment or laboratory, because, like, it's true to say, like, as soon as you said the thing about how, like, the soul is, or I'm paraphrasing, but like, let's say the soul is the part of the timeless that leaves traces and can store, which I love as a definition of the soul. Like, as soon as you say that, I'm like, yep, I know that.
Yeah.
That's true. Like I get that.
Mm-hmm.
That for me is like a helpful description of something that is part of my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I like the and also just like to bring poetry in again, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I feel what I really love about poetry is like poetry is like the experimental laboratory of trying to describe being.
Mm. Love it.
And you know, they like, yeah, these are definitely like noble and essential experiments, like whether we're quote unquote right or not.
Right.
You know, it's almost like I think part of what I in a way I feel like so much of deconditioning for me has been to realize like once I give up being right, there's so much joy and freedom in my experiments.
The beginner's mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, it's so funny because um when I first read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind,
Mm-hmm.
and he has the line, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. I first read that at the kind of early on in my spiritual life, and I thought, like, yes, this book is going to teach me how to be an expert. Because I, at that time, thought the whole idea was to have fewer and fewer possibilities until you were finally right.
Mm.
And then much later, I realized, oh my God, when he says the beginner's mind has many possibilities, he means that's a good thing.
Yeah. That's awesome.
That was like, so anyway, to the thing about there's nothing outside of God. I mean, I have to say, like, maybe this is sort of related to the yearning thing or
Mm.
the surrendering to the not being able to know thing. It's like I feel kind of pragmatic about this stuff these days
Mm-hmm.
also, or I guess as in like if believing that there's nothing outside of God like
Mm-hmm.
lights you up inside
Mm-hmm.
with peace and serenity and gratitude and a sense of connectedness and allows you to access your kindness and care towards other beings because you feel like God is in all of them, obviously, and God is in all my past mistakes as well. You know, I have a friend, another spiritual friend who likes, this is a 12-step saying, but you know, the idea is my higher power doesn't make mistakes.
Mm.
You know, and yeah, like if that belief has the payoff for you
Yeah.
of like enriching life and filling it with light and filling it with a sense of meaning, then
Yeah.
like beautiful, go for
Yeah.
it, you
Yeah.
know, like it's I guess like I don't want to dodge the question, and so I'm gonna think like, does it seem true to me?
Mm-hmm.
um I mean, sometimes I hear people say, you know, the way that they define God is reality.
Yeah.
Reality as a whole, which I
Right.
would say means it includes all the invisible worlds within worlds
Absolutely.
as well, which
Yes.
I definitely feel. So in that way, like, you know, you could like kind of sub in, you know, like if we want to do like theological mad libs, you know, we you could say like there's nothing in reality outside of reality.
Right.
reality is reality, like
Right, right.
and like I think, in a way I sort of think, I don't know if I had thought of it quite this way before, but sometimes you can almost think like in terms of different spiritual traditions, like who do you want to be talking to when you pray?
Mm.
Like, do you want it to be a non-human, like, energy field, or like pure light
Hmm.
kind of being, or like a bunch of different animals, or Jesus,
Hmm.
or Buddha, meaning a human being who just had a bunch of wonderful ideas that he shared with us. Like,
Yeah.
like again, like, I have uh, a lot, or throughout my life, I have had a lot of struggle with sleeping.
Yeah, me too.
And in the last few years, I kind of realized, part of the question with not sleeping well is if you are going to get up out of bed, which that's a big choice for an insomniac, is like, am I going to stay here or not? But
Yeah.
like once you get up, like what is the skillful thing to do during those, like, the wee small hours that is going to really benefit or serve whatever opportunities are arising from my being awake in this time.
Yeah.
And I feel like what I realized is, for me, like I'm getting up in the middle of the night and I like to go out to the garage and do praying.
Cool.
And like part of that is like you can kind of go out there and be like, okay, like who's out there? Who do I want to talk to? And who, if I put them on the other end of the line, is going to evoke from me the inner language that I most need to express from my heart right now.
Hmm.
And like, if that, so yeah, I guess it, it works for me to say there's nothing outside of God, because I find it very beneficial to feel that there is no nook or cranny anywhere in my life or my experience in any of the invisible or visible worlds that God doesn't already know about and is totally okay with.
Mm. Hmm.
God
Hmm.
can handle all the nooks and crannies, no matter how far reaching.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
that gives me solace.
Yeah. Yeah, I love your emphasis on pragmatism, and I feel the same way. I often think of the line like the truth is what is useful when it comes to
Mm.
these things, and that's kind of what you're saying. I think that was attributed to Buddha, but who knows? I think a bunch of people have said similar things, and but I think it's a great direction to put your time and energy. Like, what is useful? Um, what is actually going to nourish you? You know, and that question of like what's who do you want to be praying, who or what do you want to be praying to? I mean, I think that relates to the whole experimental approach to spirituality, where you're tinkering with different things to try, and you get different results based on your experiment. And so it's kind of this ever evolving experiment, for me at least. And I did want to touch back briefly on what you said about, the incomprehensibility of ultimate reality or something like that. And I agree with that. But there's also this element that my attention's been brought to this because of Advaita Vedanta, which is, that timeless awareness that we can uncover within ourselves. To me, that's the closest we can get to a subjective knowing of ultimate reality, I guess. And so I agree that, like, on a conceptual type of knowing and a linguistic type of knowing, I don't think that we could ever, encapsulate or capture or understand the absolute. But I think that we can uncover, like, timeless awareness within ourselves, and that's maybe like the closest bridge that we have or something. And that's just my take on that. And then um I definitely wanna ask you more about your personal life, because that's, I mean, you're the type of person that I could talk about these kind of philosophical things with all day, but I do want to funnel it back to your personal life. And I want to ask, because the way I've been kind of breaking these episodes down, and the general skeleton of it is like, experience, philosophy, and practice. And so in the on the topic of experience, I like to ask people if they've ever, are there any spiritual experiences that you might have had that you would like to share, um, and or any experiences that were kind of paradigm shifting for you that have had a lasting, significant impact on you.
Well, just to the way that you described the timeless awareness that
Mm-hmm.
we can discover, like from meditation practice,
Mm-hmm.
as the bridge, I completely agree. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
definitely, it's almost as you were saying that, I almost wanted to formulate it like, we can't know it, but we can be it.
Yes.
I
Yep.
100% agree.
I
And
like that.
the being it for even however short a time
Mm-hmm.
is like probably the deepest bliss I have known.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing better. Wish I could hang out there more.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, uh, I feel lucky in the moments when I got there ever.
Oh yeah.
Um, I know I didn't get there with my own will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I had this experience, in a way, the kind of original, maybe like call to consciously being on a spiritual path. It was in 2009. Um, I so I had been through my kind of mid 20s. I was a very overachieving person. Um, and I had a lot of identity invested in outward status and accomplishments and the veneer of a up and coming, promising young person. I was really invested in that. And then I had a series of experiences where the universe kind of gave me the gift of knocking out all the supports to that inflated persona.
Mm.
So I was in a bike accident and nothing seemed to happen at first, but then in the next couple of weeks, I developed like an intense, like debilitating knee pain that nobody could diagnose. This was in Boston, and I went to the doctor who also is the doctor for the Patriots, the football team.
Yeah.
And the guy like looked at my knee and I think did MRI and and he was like, I don't see anything wrong. I'd sign you to the Patriots. And at the same time, I couldn't walk because of the pain.
Jeez.
So there was such an incongruity between
Yeah.
the Western medicine and my experience. So my body was really like, up until that point, I had been very active and like I was really into lifting weights and getting all kinds of exercise and having endorphins. And like there was that was kind of like a steam escape valve for me, was being able to exercise a lot. And suddenly I couldn't at all almost. So that happened. I was in a very heartbreaking breakup of a relationship that was very meaningful. So I was emotionally devastated.
So that was the same time, the breakup and
all at the same time.
Wow.
I also bombed at what I thought was going to be my career, which at the time was as a literary critic, like a literary a book reviewer for like prestigious publications. And I kind of self-detonated at that. That's a kind of other story, but I basically I blew up my career, and I moved home to live with my parents. So I had complete failure to launch syndrome. And my life was just in shambles according to my expectations for it. Like I was so like, yeah, I was really in despair. And later I read like that was the beginning of a very rich time of like spiritual reading and stuff. And at one point I came across this book. You might know this. It's called Iron John by
No, I don't.
by the poet Robert Bly.
Oh yeah, I know him, but
yeah,
okay.
like I can't say I would exactly recommend it. And nowadays it's probably like not a very popular book because it sparked this like men's work movement. And these like men's circles, so some of which now I feel are very beautiful and healing spaces, very important.
Yeah.
That I am very grateful to belong to. But yeah, it's kind of all about like men's souls.
Yeah.
And the virtue of that book was he kind of was very well versed in like how other cultures and especially ancient cultures think about like the archetypes of men's development. Like what are the seasons and kind of touch points for a male person to like become basically like a good citizen and like a safe contributing being for the world. So there was this one thing in there where like this was for the Nordic, like Scandinavian tradition, where at some point a young man who was like, I was starting to have my like Saturn returns. I was like 26 at this time, 26, 27. And there was this notion that they had these long like banquet halls, and in the middle of the banquet hall was the fire where they would roast things and warm themselves.
Mm.
So there was like this trough of fire down the middle of the big banquet hall. And apparently, it was just understood archetypally that there comes a point in a young man's life where he loses all faith and heart in everything that he had ever known, and anything he thought the society owed him or promised him or that he was entitled to or that he hoped for. And he goes, after the fire goes out, he would he would go into this ash trough in the middle of the banquet hall where the fire had once been, and he would put the ashes all over his face and eat the ashes for a long time until his depression was over, and then he was ready to start his life.
Interesting.
And I was like, oh my God, like I put it in a poem at the time that I like I'm sitting in the trough eating ash sandwiches.
Nice.
Like complete, basically it like what that was, I guess, to me in retrospect is like, what is the taste of being dead? And and based on that taste, do you want to come back to life and build on it whatever you can? Because someday you will be sitting in this trough eating ashes forever, and you will be the ash. So just a little taste to remind you that your time is brief.
Yeah.
And like, it's kind of up to you what you're going to do with it.
Yeah.
And that was not explained to me by my society at the time. People thought I was depressed or suicidal. But I think I was more like on an underworld journey, eating ashes and figuring out like, what is my life about?
Yeah.
A lot of stuff happened at the time, but one thing that happened was I had the idea to try meditation. I had never done it before, and I didn't have any training, but I had like an intuition. And like another wonderful 12-step expression is the acronym for God, gift of desperation, which to me means I was willing to try anything. This was just abjection. And there's something kind of like fertile about it, because it's like the fucking orthopedic surgeon of the Patriots doesn't know what's wrong with me, and like, my college professor doesn't know, and my peers who are all going to law school don't know, like nobody knows. So I was very open to like stuff that up until that point I was defended against, because it didn't look right, and it was like, there was no value at that time given to vulnerability, especially for a man in my conditioning.
Yeah.
So I, and part of like that's, part of being depressed is basically you're being tortured by your thoughts.
Yeah.
Your thinking is torturing you mercilessly, and it's saying a lot of very demeaning, self-limiting stories and beliefs. And that's like why everything looks dead and lifeless and burnt out. So yeah, basically I was the prisoner of my thinking.
Yeah.
And I had the idea, okay, I'm gonna put down a yoga mat. Oh yeah, this is just one. At this time I had moved out of my parents' house and I was living with a childhood friend in a weird. It was like an apartment in a condo that was all, everybody else there was like a baby boomer who worked for Harvard. And we were these two like absolutely devastated, like millennial people who were eating ashes for breakfast,
Right.
So we were always wearing like all black long underwear and like this. And anyway, that was the environment. So I put this yoga mat down and I was like, okay, I'm going to lie on my back for 2 minutes and I'm going to do what I think is meditation. And I put on the first time, I was so afraid actually to be with that quality of silence because I associated my mind with the torturing. So I put on, there's a classical composer named Yannis Xenakis. Have you ever heard this guy?
I don't think so.
It's probably the most like jarring, distressing, and discordant music you could ever hear. It's like just strings like screeching.
Yeah.
But I had this idea that like if I kind of put this Xenakis music on in my headphones, it will actually drown out the torturing.
Right.
So that was how I could meditate at first. And it was sort of, yeah. And I did that for a while, only 2 minutes at a time. And eventually the time grew a little bit. And eventually I switched into a bit more like ambient, less like abrasive music. And I don't know why I kept doing it, honestly. I mean, now you could say that there was a part of me inside that was yearning to be healthy, and actually was yearning to return to life. But this thing happened where like I remember like I was on my back, I had the lights out, the yoga mat was bright green, and like I did my little meditation practice totally freestyle, and then I like dropped down. It was like my body sank into the floor. My awareness went from like the complete static and white noise and scratchy scratch on the top. It was like it dropped down, and it was like I went into a cavern, this like cathedral like cave place with, and I was completely sober. Um, uh, there was like water at the bottom. It was like a secret underground like aquifer is what it felt like, and the water was like bluish green, and there was this kind of like dome of the cave above it, and I was like on my back, and like I could see that like way up at the top like of the dome, my torturous thoughts were sort of like skittering around a little bit, but they were so far. They were like just little pencil scratches, or it was like, or they were like little bits of scar tissue that I could just see, like, oh, that's just like a little scarring on my consciousness, but like my actual consciousness is like this other 99%, which is this pristine cavernous place. And it was the first time, I mean, maybe I had moments of this in childhood completely accidentally. I did feel like it wasn't a completely new, it was a little bit of recovering or rediscovering something that was familiar or innate.
Yeah.
But certainly, as an adult and in the last few years during this time when I was eating the ashes, I hadn't felt anything like this. But suddenly, like, I was down there in the cavern, nothing had changed about my life, none of the external circumstances. And I felt such serenity.
Mm,
Like, oh my God. It was like it was like, hallelujah.
it's beautiful.
This place, like this beautiful cavernous place that like I accessed not on drugs,
Hmm.
totally for free,
Hmm.
just like, yeah, like, and I kind of felt like, oh my God, like I can come here any time.
Yeah.
This is the truth. And like, honestly, I feel like I that was kind of the day I really became a practitioner of meditation. And I've done it now for about 12 years pretty diligently. And
Mm,
it's all basically just been trying to elaborate on that experience in the
yeah.
aquifer.
Wow. That's incredible. I'm glad, I appreciate you sharing that. And that was a perfect bridge to what I wanted to talk about practice. So that was perfect. Do you feel like after you had that experience, was there a tangible shift in your overall kind of, I don't know, default settings or being after that?
Well, I mean, it's so touching, people who have beautiful meditation experiences, most of the time you come back to your life and the torture just kind of starts
Right.
back up.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
like, it definitely doesn't change anything overnight,
Right.
and in a way, I feel like that experience in the cavern, that was a seed that I felt I had the opportunity or the gift to water and cultivate with the rest of my life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, so it was more like, it wasn't like it did not transform or like heal or negate all my
Hmm.
problems, but I think what it did was like it instilled, there was like a moment of hope which had been completely absent in the ash period. And the hope, because there was that feeling of like, I can return to this, and this is, I wouldn't have said this at the time, but like, this is my true nature.
Yeah.
The sense of recognition and the sense of availability of
Mm,
that feeling, like there was like the like tiniest like way on the horizon, like little like glimmer of faith.
hmm.
Faith had become possible,
Mm,
and that was absolutely life changing and transforming because it gave a direction,
yeah.
but it definitely didn't like um solve any of thing for me at the time except my deepest motivation in life.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Well, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to leave probably in about 7 minutes because I have to teach a class. But in this last little bit here, um, since you're being trained as a mindfulness meditation teacher, I assume that mindfulness meditation is kind of the style of meditation that you've maybe gotten the most out of. And so, I just wanted to ask, like, number one, is that true? Is mindfulness meditation kind of the style of meditation that you've returned to the most or felt like was the most useful for you? And then number two, if you could just say, give a brief breakdown of the type of workshops you do.
Sure. Well, yeah, the type of meditation that I do is insight, which is westernized, kind of secularized Buddhist practice.
Mm-hmm.
It has some Western psychology, and it also has a lot of the core teachings that the Buddha offered on, like, watching the breath and mindfulness of the body and stuff. So yeah, I like that tradition so much because it's very nurturing, and it's not strict or prescriptive at all. A lot of, I mean, for me, especially nowadays, a lot of it is really about compassion and boundless friendliness, or what they would call metta practice.
Yeah.
The basic thing I do is I basically just use the anchor point of my body, and I return to the sensations of it over and over again. That's basically what it is. Yeah. So yeah, mindfulness in the sense that it's not really it's not really trying to define the metaphysics.
Yeah.
And that works for me because most of the time I need help leaving the virtual reality and coming back to what is true in my body in this moment. I don't need help connecting with the stratosphere. Like, right. I need to come down.
Yeah.
And then briefly, yeah, the workshops, I mean, a lot of it. So basically, I feel the way my life seems to be leading is having had all of these, like, Buddhist or Eastern or New Age or shamanic, or like all of these kinds of, or poetic experiences. I'm like trying to somehow come back to Judaism and work within that tradition and discipline, and like allow life to flow through it the way I wish had been flowing through it when it was exposed to me.
Yeah.
So the workshops are basically like, I collaborate with a wonderful song leader and kind of very learned young woman named Eliana Light, and we kind of take people like back into a particular, like, very traditional prayer or moment on a holiday, and have people like really like excavate the meaning of it, reinvent it, come to it freshly, write their own prayer, like be in dialogue with the author of that prayer, like take them out for a coffee and write about your conversation, and trying to find the same, it's very aligned with what I do in the creative work. Like, I retold the Isaac and Abraham story 50 weird times. I retold the King Saul. I retell Hasidic stories. Like, I'm trying to make something in the Jewish, like, soul alive.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Have you been doing any of that through Zoom during the pandemic?
Okay. Yeah, in a way, that particular collaboration with Eliana kind of took off over Zoom because she's on the East Coast. So we had several, and now we're working on putting together programs more like for Jewish institutions. And yeah, I mean, it's a constantly evolving thing. I feel in some way that I'm still trying to understand or even accept. Like, I just feel really called to work within this Jewish tradition, even though I didn't really get what I wanted from it. Like, it's not the basis of my spirituality, but it is the basis of my soul.
Mm. Yeah, I really admire how like interdisciplinary you seem to be about this sort of thing, and how you're trying to bring creativity and poetry into spiritual practice, and just this desire to like make these ancient stories and ancient practices like traditional prayers or something, and trying to get people to re-envision them, or see them with fresh eyes, or kind of experimentally develop their own personal relationship, so that it's not some dead thing. It's actually this living active force, and so I really like that. And it's cool that you're trying to integrate all the things that you learn maybe outside of Judaism back into that. And that's really cool. I love that. And this was a great conversation. I've been telling pretty much all my guests that I want to have a part two, so I'd love to have a part two with you. I think we could riff about this stuff for a long time, and it's kind of cool to get like a part one down, where we just lay the foundation, and I hear about the person's background and past, and then the second one we can kind of just get into interesting just like existential and spiritual and practical and pragmatic questions. So thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, it was really such a pleasure, Matthew. I'm so thankful to you for inviting me, and for all of the depth and care. Like, I love that you are on your own experimental journey, and
Mm-hmm.
so we're basically just like, crossing paths on the journey.
Yep.
And saying like, did you see that?
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, I will reach out to you at some point for a part two. I will send you the link when this is up. I'm going to put the link to your God's eyebrows monologue in the show notes. And aside from that, is there anything else that you would recommend the viewer, or anything else online that the viewer, where the viewer could check you out?
I have a website. Why don't I'll send you the link to the website as well,
Perfect.
and that has a bunch of other things on it.
Perfect. Awesome. Take care, Alexander. You have a good rest of your day. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Matthew.
Peace.
Peace.